Saudi students sometimes come here to study TESOL so they can go back to Saudi Arabia and teach English, which is a big career there right now. And when they come here, they're usually taught typically by monolingual teachers, professors, who in a classroom that is usually mostly English speaking, and a lot of them also are interested in K through 12 in heterogeneous classrooms where code switching would not be used. And code switching is where you would use more than one language in a classroom, in a language classroom. For instance, in the case of the Saudis, they would use Arabic in order to help teach English. And the literature is showing that this is a viable teaching practice when used strategically. But when the Saudis come here, that code switching is only taught theoretically, but it's not taught practically. So they don't really learn to utilize or perfect that skill that they naturally have as bilinguals. And so I'm looking at that as a problem. And a secondary problem is that in Saudi and many other countries, the policies are against code switching, even though Al-Hamzi, for instance, makes a very strong case for it. And the literature, actually, the scholarship is almost unanimous for it. Saudi Arabia has a traditional culture, and the education originally was based in Islam. In the 7th century, the parents and religious leaders would teach Islam to their children, so that morality got attached to education, and there's a place of authority for the teacher. A lot of the knowledge is disseminated rather than created in teacher-student relationships, and that's quite a bit different than what we're finding in a lot of the Western pedagogy. But now, and of course there's a lot of things leading up to that, to now, in between, but in 10 minutes, I'll skip a few things. And as you know now, the oil industry, industrialization, globalization, the importance of English in the international job market, all of these things are changing Saudi education. And the standard of living also went up very high in the country, so there's a lot more people and interest in participation in the international job market. So English has entered the Saudi job market. And with this kind of high context culture, there's a kind of a swing back and forth between globalization and modernization in the international job market, all the ambitions and interests with that, and also the interest with preserving the authentic culture. And so one of the rationales for why this is important, for one, there's a need for expansion of training for more quantity of EFL teachers because of the rapid expansion of the educational system. And then there's also a need for a higher quality. And teaching code switching can help do both of those, but especially for native speakers. And the reason that I'd like to do that is to get more native speakers into these positions, to make them more competitive with native English speakers and expatriates, because they can frame the content in the English language in a way that's culturally sensitive and as a secondary. So the code switching will help them be competitive as teachers because it's a part of training. Also, code switching itself is linked with identity. So, this can help mitigate hegemony. The purpose of my project is to create two things. One is a primer on the legitimacy of code switching as a teaching practice. Even though a lot of the literature is pro-code switching, the administrators and policymakers, the agencies involved, are enforcing monolingualism. And this can have an effect on the teachers so that they are also don't recognize the value of their own naturally given abilities as bilinguals and not pursue educating themselves on how to use it in the most effective ways and to eliminate the pitfalls of code switching, because there can be some problems with it too. And so, firstly, I want to produce a primer that will present the case for code switching, and there's a lot of evidence for that. And then secondly, a handbook that students can use independent of classroom work, the Saudi students in places like the United States, in English-dominant countries, to help them identify what good code switching is and what isn't, and do some basic training on that, and find resources for places to do observation, because there are a few select places where code switching is used in the United States in bilingual classrooms. Certain types and theories behind bilingualism do involve code switching in the United States. So that's what I want to produce. Now the limitations of that, for one, it's not necessarily as good as live curricula in a university teaching code switching, but it's a supplement to help make up for that. And it's for the Saudi students specifically. This could impact others that are vested in the TESOL and have opportunities, especially in the EFL market elsewhere. But it's going to be specifically designed for the Saudi students to use in Saudi, so it has Saudi Arabia in mind. Now, it also has a limitation in that it's not necessarily aimed at policymakers for them to change the policies. I think that's a harder thing to convince people of. But helping teachers to know the legitimacy and to legitimize their own practice of it could have a bottom-up effect and eventually change policy. And that actually, I mean, that's part of the future of this, is that I would like to see eventually one day policy change, and that could affect the children, and it could affect my future career, because I want to teach in Saudi one day. And I may or may not, I can code mix, which is where you just throw in some lexicon. I may be able to develop my Arabic to the point I can code switch. But mostly I want to improve the environment I work in. And another reason it's important to me is because I'm a Muslim, and again, preserving Saudi culture is part of what the purpose of this whole thing, and the importance of it. And so I have a quick example that will demonstrate to a certain degree how important Arabic is to keep in the classroom, even in the English classroom, so that when students are in an English environment, we still get the unifying role of Arabic in there, and as a confirmation and a support for their identity. If a Muslim says, Insha'Allah, then that means if Allah wills. And it's important for the Muslim, and this is close to the Saudi identity as well, it's not a completely uniform society, but Islam is very important there, then that means if I say, I'm going to meet you tomorrow at 3 o'clock, then I'll say, Insha'Allah, if Allah wills, because that means I don't know for sure what's going to happen between now and there. I have the intention, but Allah knows what plan will really happen. And so that recognition of Allah is very, very important. What can happen is the Saudi will enter into the English environment. They might change that to Allah willing, so other people understand it. Now we've dropped the Arabic, so part of the culture is missing, but the idea is still there and the belief is still there, so a lot of the culture stays. That's pretty good. Now, let's say someone's interviewing or writing to a professor and they don't want to mention Allah because they don't know how this is going to be taken. Then they might say, I'll plan on seeing you tomorrow at 3. Now, the Arabic is gone, and the culture is partly gone, but it's still there. It's hidden. The culture is hidden. Now, they might take one step further and say, I want to really sound English. I want to sound like a Westerner. And this is where, if we really start to fully embrace English and the English culture and lose the Arabic, the identity starts to change. Because then the person might say something like, I will see you tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Now, there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, but from the Saudi identity, there is something wrong with that. From the Islamic perspective, there is something wrong with that, because now the Arabic is omitted, the culture is omitted, and the belief is omitted.
Thanks so much for watching.